Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 21, Section 1, the Nixon Administration. So, we're going to get into talking a little bit about Richard Nixon, but just kind of a recap. In 1968, we had a presidential election. It was a very frustrating year. We had several Democrats that had thrown their hats in the ring, like Eugene McCarthy. At the beginning of the campaign, we still had Lyndon B. Johnson that was in the race. Eventually, he pulls out. We have Robert Kennedy that enters the race. Robert Kennedy's assassinated. We have Hubert Humphrey that enters the race. So, number one, the presidential candidate in 1968 who appealed to many frustrated citizens was no other than Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was a Republican. He had ran before in 1960 against John F. Kennedy. He had been vice president under Dwight Eisenhower. So this is a guy who has had a little bit of experience. Nixon's principal opponent was a guy named Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey was the vice president under Lyndon Johnson and kind of was a latecomer to the whole race. A lot of it has to do with LBJ pulling out and the fact that we have some controversy with the assassination of Robert Kennedy. So, needless to say, these two men are going to run against each other, and to help gain support for Nixon in this 1968 campaign, Nixon met with some powerful Southerners. Just so you kind of know, kind of the backstory, Southern politics has always been really kind of in the hands of the Democratic Party. And this is something that kind of comes back and haunts us maybe after the Reconstruction, after the American Civil War. But in the Deep South, there were still a lot of Democrats. And Nixon knew that he needed to reach out to the Democrats that were in the South to build some kind of alliance so he could actually win this election. And so he met with Democratic senator from South Carolina named Strom Thurmond. You see Thurmond pictured there in the left-hand corner with Richard Nixon. Thurmond had been a senator for many, many years, and he was one of the more stronger voices calling for the end of many of these desegregation programs that were being handed down by the Johnson administration or even some of the rulings of the U.S. Supreme Court. The thing that's interesting about Strom Thurmond, even though he comes off as really being kind of an anti-desegregation kind of guy, is that he has kind of a backstory. He has a kind of a skeleton in his closet, so to speak. This is a man that really didn't marry until he was much later in life, but didn't necessarily mean that he hadn't had affairs and things of that nature. And Thurmond had been a member of the U.S. Senate up until his death just recently. Matter of fact, I think he is probably the longest serving and maybe the oldest U.S. senator in American history, because he passed away after he had turned 100 and he was still a member of the U.S. Senate. But after he dies, there's a story that eventually kind of hits the airwaves, and that Strom Thurmond actually had a daughter named Essa May Washington Williams. Essa May Washington Williams was his biracial daughter. She was born to a mother who was black, and her father was Strom Thurmond. And throughout her life, Thurmond had actually financially supported her. So it wasn't like he ran away from his responsibilities of fatherhood, but he did not necessarily make this known to anyone. And matter of fact, she could have come forward years before, never did. Until after he had passed away. As a matter of fact, in the time since, she has passed away. But needless to say, when that news broke that he had a black daughter, that really surprised a lot of people in our country. So going back, this whole idea of working with the Southerners who were Democrats became known as the Southern Strategy. And to get Thurmond to kind of go along with what Nixon was wanting to do. Nixon was going to have to concede a few things. And one of the things that he was willing to do was to kind of slow down desegregation in the United States. He worked to overturn several civil rights policies that were basically imposed by presidents before him. And, as a matter of fact, he reversed a decision by the Johnson administration that would cut off federal funds for racially segregated schools. Nixon went ahead and gave those funds back. So needless to say, that was how Nixon was able to gain support of the Democrats in the Deep South. And what's interesting is not long after some of these Democrats start supporting Republican ideology, many of them leave their Democratic roots and become Republicans. So, number 4, Nixon's New Federalism dismantled a number of the federal programs and gave more control to state and local governments. Critics of the nation's welfare system, sometimes known as aid to families with dependent children, urged that the system was structured so that it was actually better for poor people to apply for benefits than to take on a lower paying job. What's interesting is during the years that Nixon is in office, he is willing to do something called impounding of funds. And impounding basically is this: Congress appropriates money for a certain program, for example, aid to families with dependent children, and the president refuses to budget the money or to spend the money that's been allotted. Nixon impounded funds, and eventually some of this goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in the early 70s that the practice of impoundment was actually unconstitutional. Number 6, Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, believed that abandoning the war in Vietnam would damage the United States' position in the world. And what this all kind of trickles down to is this whole concept of Vietnamization, this idea that what we're going to try to do is to gradually withdraw our troops, but at the same time training the South Vietnamese to defend themselves. And all of this becomes known as the Nixon Doctrine in number 7, which basically stated that the United States would expect its allies to take care of their own defense. We might help them at times, but I mean, as far as taking on the responsibility of basically policing themselves, that should be in the hands of other people and not the U.S. military. Number 8, Nixon was a staunch anti-communist, but he and Henry Kissinger rejected the notion of a bipolar world where you had superpowers that confronted each other. And what Kissinger and Nixon tried to do is to figure out a way that they could find some kind of common ground. So on number 9, Nixon and Kissinger also believed that engagement in negotiations with the communists offered a better way for the United States to achieve its international goals. And with the help of Kissinger, Nixon was able to fashion an approach called détente, or the relaxation of tensions between the United States and its major communist rivals, which would be basically China and the Soviet Union. So in 1972, when we're still kind of fighting the Vietnam War, Kissinger had met with Chinese officials in secret and eventually was able to get an agreement where Nixon could travel to China and to meet Mao Zedong and to talk relationships. So Nixon began to improve relationships with China when he lifted trade and travel restrictions. He also withdrew the Seventh Fleet from defending the island of Taiwan. As a result of this, we kind of start opening up relations again with China, which had pretty much ceased in 1949 after China fell to the communist. What's going to happen in the late 70s is that Chinese students, if they would like to come to the United States to finish their college education, were allowed to come here with travel visas, which they hadn't been able to have before. Kind of making the Soviets a little jealous that the Chinese had kind of one-up them. Eventually, a trip to the Soviet Union is going to pan out, or it's going to happen. Making a trip to China in 72, Nixon hope not only to strengthen the ties with Chinese, but the Soviets, to maybe pursue some diplomacy. And maybe through that little fit of jealousy, the Soviets, under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev, went ahead and they agreed to meet in May of 1972, holding a summit. And as a result of this meeting in Moscow, we're going to sign a very important agreement in number 14, something known as the SALT Agreement, or the Strategic Arm Limitation Talks. These discussions were set up to limit the number of nuclear weapons and actually kind of limiting how we were going to test weapons as well. In return, the United States would start increasing trade with the Soviet Union, and we're going to start sharing scientific information. Matter of fact, just a few short years after this trip, the United States, NASA primarily, and the Soviet Space Service actually worked together on some joint missions, and we're still doing that yet to this day. Thank you very much.